Hello, my dear friends. This coming Friday, Zion Av will be my father's 7th yahrzeit. Rav Chaim Mendel, Rav Yosef Dov, Zecher Tzadik Livrocha, and I'd like to share with you a brief thought in his memory. This week's Parsha is called Parashas Maasai because it details the journeys of the Jewish people when they were in the desert. And the Chumash outlines 42 different stops that the Jews made in the desert. And there's a whole series of psukim, they all are patterned the same way. Vayisu me Ramses, they traveled from Ramses, Vayisu Vayachel Mesukos, and they camped in Sukkos. Vayisu me Sukkos, they traveled from Sukkos, Vayachel me Esa, and they camped in Esa. So the first question is, there's 42 of these travels. Why do I need to know that there were 42 travels? Of what importance is it, and what is the significance? There are many, many different answers to this question. The Shalach HaKodesh, who was a great Kabbalist in the 17th century, says that in every person's life, there are 42 stations of travel. A person goes from one level to the next. There's 42 different levels. And the 42 stations of the Jewish people reflect these 42 stations in every person's life. We don't know what exactly those 42 stations are. I mean, we know how to divide a person's life into different periods. There's childhood, adolescence, adulthood, middle age, old age. But where do you get these 42, and what's the significance of each one? We don't know. But that's what the Shalah says, that the Torah details 42 times they traveled because there's 42 different levels of achievement, religious, spiritual achievement in a person's life. Now let me ask you, the Chumash speaks about Vayisu Vayachanu. They traveled and they camped. Vayisu me Ramses, Vayachanu b'Sukkos. They traveled from Ramses, they camped in Sukkos. What is more important? If the Torah is telling me 42 times that they traveled, what is more important? Where they traveled from or where they camped? So I would say it's a no-brainer. Of course, what's important is where they camped. If those camps represent 42 different levels of achievement, so what's important is first they reached this level in Ramses, then they came to Sukkos. It's not important for me to know that they left Ramses in order to go to Sukkos. What's important for me to know is they went to Sukkos. So the question then is, so why is the parsha called Maasai? Why is it Maasai is the travels, is that they left these 42 places. And the Chumash says, Elu Maasai v'nei Yisrael. These are the travels of the Jewish people. It doesn't say Elu HaChanuyos. These are the encampments of the Jewish people. It says these are the travels. Why emphasize the travel? What's important is, if there's 42 stages, so talk about what they achieved, not the fact that they went from one place to the other. You know what it's like? If somebody lived in a number of cities over the course, let's say, the last 5 years, and you ask the person, so where have you been? So the person will say he was in Boston, he was in New York, he was in Chicago, he was in Los Angeles. He's not going to say, well, I was in Boston. From Boston, I traveled to New York. From New York, I traveled to Chicago. From Chicago, I traveled to Los Angeles. Who cares where you traveled from? Just tell me where you were. I was in Boston, I was in New York, I was in Chicago, I was in Los Angeles. So why does the Torah emphasize Vayisu me? They left from this place and they came to that place. Just tell me, these are the places where the Jewish people camped during the period of the 40 years in the desert, and then list the whole line of 42 locations. Says the Lubavitcher Rabbi, a beautiful thought. The Rabbi says, because the Torah is emphasizing that in life, what's important is not where you get to. What's important is that you're always trying to go to the next level, because a person is never allowed to be satisfied, never complacent, never sit on his laurels, never say, wow, look at me, I've reached this place. Now I'm at a plateau. I don't have to try harder anymore. Wrong. If a person has energy, and a person has strength, and a person has more years of life, then a person constantly has to uproot himself from where he was. He has to redefine himself or herself constantly. And therefore the Torah emphasizes not where they came to, but it emphasizes the Maasai. It's the travels. It's the fact that they were able to reinvigorate themselves and to redefine themselves and to reestablish themselves and to leave where they were in order, even though where they were was important, but what it was significant is that they weren't complacent and they left the previous place, and now they went to a higher place. And that's a tremendous lesson in a person's life. No matter how old a person is not allowed to be satisfied. Whether a person is a youngster, or a person's middle-aged, or a person is retired. A lot of times people are retired and they say, I'm done. I worked so hard my whole life. I was involved. I'm not interested in doing anything anymore. Let some of the younger people take over. That's not the right way to look at things. That's not the Torah view. If a person has energy and he has strength and he has koyach and he has ability and he has talents, use them and use them in a way that it brings you to the next level. Never be satisfied. Doesn't matter. You could be 100 years old. Don't be satisfied where you are. Always strive to go to the next position. And my father epitomized this. My father was a person who throughout his life, he constantly was growing. He was a very innovative and creative person. My father grew up in Seattle, Washington. Until he was 19, he never stepped foot in a yeshiva. He had there was a Talmud Torah program after school, but he didn't learn yeshiva. When he was 19, he was inspired. He wanted to join Yeshiva University in New York. In those days, people didn't travel by plane. My father, he came to Yeshiva University in 1944, I believe. My father went by train to Yeshiva University, 1943. He went by train. It took 5 days to reach Yeshiva University. And in those days, people didn't talk on the telephone. It was too expensive. People wrote letters. My father did not go home for 5 years. He was in Yeshiva University for 5 years right before he was married. My father went back to Seattle, Washington to visit with his parents. That was the level of the commitment and devotion that my father had to yeshiva education. My father he took a position in Spring Valley, in Yeshiva Spring Valley. Then but his love was Rabbanus, so after a year, he left for Holyoke, Massachusetts. He was there for 8 years. But then he felt he wanted to do something more. So he came to New York, to Forest Hills, became the rabbi of the Young Israel Forest Hills. My father was always busy, enormously busy. But that didn't matter. He was always looking for new things to do, always innovating new programs. And my father in particular became heavily involved in the national Young Israel movement. They had a national office in New York. My father was there all the time, and he was involved in all sorts of different projects. In 1963, my father and my mother, Aleichem Shalom, made a visit to Eretz Yisrael, and my father saw that in Israel you had many people who were Holocaust survivors or who had grown up in Europe, and they were disconnected. And Israel did not have a shul structure the way we have in America, where that becomes a center of a focal social center of activity, and these people were lost. And my father felt they need to have an American type of shul in Israel with an American type of rabbi who could reach out to the people. So my father helped establish the Young Israel movement in Eretz Yisrael. And while he was in America, he devoted himself to that day and night. He had so much to do, but he was so certain that was important. And then when my father moved to Eretz Yisrael, he retired in 1983. So my father was over 60. And my father could have said, well, he was almost 60. He could have said, well, it's now, I'm finished. Now let somebody else take over. On the contrary, he devoted himself day and night when he was in Eretz Yisrael he built 30 Young Israels across the land of Eretz Yisrael, and they helped install rabbis in those Young Israels. And at that time, when my father was active, it was a very powerful movement, and the shuls had an impact on many, many people. And then my father felt that there's the Young Israel rabbis. They're retired. What are they doing when they're retired? There's so much talent there. They shouldn't be just sitting in Israel retired, enjoying the good life. So my father organized them, and they got involved in different programs. They published svarim, and they did outreach. They gave shiurim. I remember once my father told me he's going to have a meeting with the Jerusalem Post because the Israeli media had a certain level of hostility to Orthodox Jews, and my father felt, as American rabbis, we know how to speak their language. Let's try to bridge the gap between the secular and the religious. And throughout his life, my father was always growing, and he published nonstop. My father published numerous articles. He was a world-class expert in Medrash. He was always writing. Whenever I saw my father, he had 25 svarim on his table, and he was pulling this and pulling that. He was a very big bucky in Medrash and in Tanakh, and he was very creative. And even until until the point of time where he no longer was able to write, my father was constantly involved in creating and developing and doing new things. So he epitomized this idea of Elam Maasai, that what's important is not Vayachanu, where they camped. It's from Vayisu. Where did they leave from? They left from, they were in Ramses, but they didn't stay in Ramses. They had to go to the next level. They had to go to Sukkot. So it's not important. What's significant is that they left Ramses because they felt, well, of course they left because the Kadosh Baruch Hu told them to do so. But the point is, don't be satisfied where you are. No matter what age you are, no matter what stage, no matter what you've accomplished, no matter what you've achieved. You may have learned Daf Yomi 5 times. You may be a Baki in Shas. You may have given tens of $1,000s to tzedakah. You may have turned over the character of your life. Whatever it is that a person has done, never say that's enough. I'm satisfied. I'm finished. Always strive for the next level, and it's something that my father's life always inspires me. And Parashas Maasai, even the name of the parsha, Ve'elu Maasai, emphasizes that what's important is not Vayachanu. It's not where you stop. It's Vayisu. It's the fact that you're traveling and going to the next level.